My father stood in the doorway of the venue holding the deposit check I had written, ripped it in half, and said the words that would change everything between us forever. "We're not wasting money on this joke of a wedding. You're marrying beneath you, and I won't finance your biggest mistake." 300 guests. 6 months of planning. One sentence that destroyed it all. But what he didn't know was that the daughter he humiliated in front of wedding planners and caterers was about to show him exactly what a joke looked like. And he was the punchline. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The venue smelled like lilacs and fresh paint when my father walked through the entrance that Tuesday afternoon. I had specifically chosen the Riverside estate because the gardens reminded me of the summers the first spent at my grandmother's house before she passed, back when family gatherings meant laughter instead of judgment. The coordinator, a woman named Melissa Chun who had planned over 200 weddings, was walking me through the final timeline when I heard his voice echo across the marble foyer. My stomach dropped before I even turned around. He was not supposed to be there. This was my appointment, my planning session, my wedding that I had been organizing independently for half a year. My name is Caroline Mitchell, and I had learned early in life that my father, Robert Mitchell, measured worth in very specific currencies. Professional titles, annual income, social connections that could be leveraged for business advantage. My fiancé, Daniel Rivera, possessed none of these qualifications according to my father's rigid accounting system. Daniel worked as a high school history teacher, coached the debate team after hours, and spent his weekends volunteering with the literacy program in underserved communities. He made $48,000 annually, drove a 7-year-old sedan, and had never attended the country club mixers where my father conducted his informal business dealings. In my father's worldview, these facts did not describe a good man with strong values. They described failure. Robert Mitchell had built his wealth through commercial real estate development, transforming vacant lots and struggling properties into profitable ventures. He approached relationships with the same transactional mindset he brought to property acquisition. People were investments that either appreciated or depreciated in value. My mother, Diane, had appreciated considerably when they married. She came from established money, brought social connections that opened doors for his early projects, and understood implicitly that her role involved enhancing his reputation rather than challenging his decisions. My older brother, Trevor, had appreciated by following the prescribed path into corporate law, marrying another attorney from a prominent family, and producing grandchildren who attended the right private schools. I had been depreciating steadily since college when I chose social work over business administration. The depreciation accelerated when I took a position with a nonprofit organization serving foster youth, instead of joining a corporate human resources department, where I could have earned 3 times the salary. My father tolerated these disappointments with barely concealed frustration, making comments at family dinners about wasted potential and misguided idealism. But when I introduced Daniel 18 months ago at a family birthday celebration, tolerance transformed into active opposition. The campaign against my relationship began subtly. My father would ask pointed questions about Daniel's career trajectory, nodding with exaggerated patience when Daniel explained his passion for education. He made casual observations about financial security and the importance of planning for the future. He forwarded articles about teacher salaries and retirement planning with messages suggesting concern for my well-being. When subtlety failed to achieve the desired result, his approach became more direct. He arranged introductions to single professionals he knew through business connections, men with impressive credentials who could provide the lifestyle he believed I deserved. When I declined these transparent setups, he progressed to open criticism of Daniel during family gatherings, questioning his ambition and suggesting that someone truly committed to building a future would pursue more lucrative opportunities. Daniel handled the hostility with remarkable grace. He never responded to provocations, never defended himself against implications that he was inadequate, never allowed my father's disdain to affect his treatment of me. This restraint infuriated my father further because it denied him the confrontation that would have justified his contempt. A man who fought back could be dismissed as volatile or insecure. A man who remained calm and focused on building our relationship could not be easily categorized as the failure my father needed him to be. When Daniel proposed on a hiking trail overlooking the valley where we had our first date, I called my parents from the summit with joy that felt pure and uncomplicated. My mother answered, and I heard genuine happiness in her voice as she congratulated us. Then my father took the phone. His response consisted of a single question delivered in a tone that communicated everything his words did not state explicitly. "Are you certain this is what you want, Caroline?" The question carried weight beyond its surface meaning. It was not inquiry but warning, not concern but threat. I told him I had never been more certain of anything in my life. The silence that followed stretched long enough that I checked my phone to see if the call had disconnected. The months that followed involved planning a wedding, while navigating an undeclared war. My mother participated enthusiastically in the public aspects of preparation, attending dress shopping appointments and offering opinions on floral arrangements. But in private moments, she delivered messages clearly originating from my father. Had I considered postponing the wedding to ensure we were truly compatible? Did I understand that marriage to someone without financial resources would involve sacrifices I might not anticipate? Was I aware that family support often depended on family approval? These questions arrived packaged as maternal concern, but the agenda behind them was unmistakable. I made the decision early in the planning process to finance the wedding independently. Daniel and I both understood that accepting money from my father would give him leverage to influence decisions or worse, to hold the financial contribution over us for years to come. We established a budget that reflected our actual resources, rather than my family's wealth. We chose a venue that was beautiful but affordable, hired a photographer who was building her portfolio, selected a DJ instead of a live band, and planned a menu that was elegant but modest. Every choice represented our values rather than my father's expectations, and every choice felt like an act of quiet rebellion. The guest list became a particular point of contention. My father insisted that business associates should be included, people I had never met who apparently needed to be invited because social obligations demanded reciprocity. When I explained that we were keeping the wedding intimate with only close friends and family, he responded that my definition of necessity demonstrated how little I understood about maintaining important relationships. I held firm on the guest list, but the conversation revealed something important about how my father conceptualized the wedding. To him, it was not a celebration of my marriage but rather a social event that reflected on his family's status. My insistence on autonomy was not merely disappointing but personally insulting, as though I was deliberately sabotaging his reputation. 3 weeks before the wedding, my father requested a private lunch meeting. I agreed, hoping that proximity to the actual date might have softened his opposition. We met at the restaurant in his office building, a place where he conducted business lunches and wielded the home field advantage. He ordered for both of us without asking my preferences, a small power play that set the tone for what followed. He began with what sounded like conciliation, acknowledging that I was an adult capable of making my own decisions. Then he pivoted to the actual purpose of the meeting. He had done research into Daniel's background. He knew that Daniel's parents had divorced when he was young, that his mother had worked multiple jobs to support the family, that Daniel had attended public schools and state universities on scholarships. He presented these facts as though they were evidence in a trial, proof that Daniel came from circumstances that made him fundamentally incompatible with our family. When I responded that Daniel's background demonstrated resilience and determination rather than inadequacy, my father leaned back in his chair and delivered his assessment with the certainty of someone stating an objective truth rather than a biased opinion. "You're making an emotional decision that will have practical consequences. When the romance fades and you're dealing with a limited income, a modest house and restricted opportunities, you will resent him. You will resent me for not stopping you. This marriage will fail, Caroline, and the failure will be expensive in ways that extend beyond money. I'm trying to protect you from a mistake that will define your life." I left that lunch understanding that my father viewed my wedding not as the beginning of my adult life, but as the end of his control over it. His opposition had nothing to do with legitimate concerns about compatibility or financial stability. It reflected his inability to accept that I had chosen a path that did not align with his values or enhance his social standing. The marriage threatened his narrative about what constituted success and worth. If I could be happy with someone he deemed inadequate, it suggested that his entire value system might be flawed. That possibility was intolerable. The Tuesday afternoon when everything shattered began ordinarily enough. I had scheduled the venue walkthrough to finalize logistics with Melissa, the wedding coordinator. We were reviewing the timeline for the ceremony and reception, discussing placement of tables and flow of guests from one space to another. Daniel was at work, teaching his afternoon classes, planning to join us later to review the sound system setup. My mother was supposed to attend but had called that morning with a migraine, a convenient ailment that had been appearing with increasing frequency whenever wedding planning required her presence. I heard the main entrance doors open and assumed it was a staff member or perhaps another client arriving for a separate appointment. Then I heard my father's voice asking where he could find the Mitchell wedding consultation. Melissa glanced at me with a question in her expression, and I felt my chest tighten with a premonition I could not quite articulate. I walked toward the foyer, my heels clicking against the polished floor, each step carrying me toward a confrontation I had been avoiding for months. My father stood in the center of the entrance hall wearing the charcoal suit he favored for important business meetings. He held a leather portfolio under one arm and an expression that communicated he was there to conduct a transaction rather than have a conversation. Melissa excused herself tactfully, sensing family tension that did not require her presence. The moment we were alone, my father opened the portfolio and removed a check I immediately recognized. It was the deposit I had written to the venue 3 months earlier, $5,000 that secured our date and locked in our contract. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He held the check between his hands and tore it in half with deliberate precision. The sound of paper ripping echoed in the high-ceiling space, and I watched the 2 pieces flutter to the marble floor like leaves falling from a dying tree. When he spoke, his voice carried the cold finality of a judge delivering a verdict. We're not wasting money on this joke of a wedding. You're marrying beneath you, Caroline, and I will not finance your biggest mistake. This ends now. The words landed like physical blows, each one calculated to wound. But it was not merely what he said. It was where he chose to say it. He had driven to the venue, walked past the gardens where I planned to exchange vows, entered the building where 200 people were supposed to celebrate with us in less than 3 weeks, and he had staged his rejection in the most humiliating way possible. He wanted witnesses to my defeat. He wanted the venue coordinator, the staff, anyone within earshot to know that my wedding was not legitimate enough to deserve his support. I stood frozen, staring at the torn check on the floor, my mind struggling to process what was happening. This was not merely disapproval or continued opposition. This was sabotage. He was attempting to destroy my wedding through public humiliation and financial manipulation. The check he had torn was not his. I had paid the deposit from my own account with money I had saved independently. But he had somehow obtained access to my account, written himself a check, brought it here for the specific purpose of this theatrical destruction. My hands were shaking when I finally found my voice. That's my money. You had no right to access my account. He smiled, an expression that contained no warmth, only satisfaction at having anticipated my response. You're still on the account I opened for you in high school. Technically, it's a joint account, which means I have every right to manage funds that might be used irresponsibly. Consider this an intervention. The full scope of his planning became clear. He had not acted impulsively. He had researched his access to my finances, identified an account I had forgotten was technically shared, and crafted a scenario designed to maximize my humiliation and demonstrate his power. This was not a father concerned about his daughter's well-being. This was a man punishing his daughter for defying his authority. Melissa had retreated to her office, but I could see her through the glass partition, clearly uncomfortable and uncertain how to proceed. Other staff members had paused in their tasks, pretending not to watch while obviously aware that something significant was unfolding. My father's voice had carried throughout the first floor, ensuring that his pronouncement about the joke wedding reached as many ears as possible. I bent down and picked up the 2 halves of the check, holding them together as though the paper could be mended as easily as torn. My father watched me with an expression of grim satisfaction, clearly believing he had delivered a decisive blow that would force me to reconsider or at minimum delay the wedding until I came to my senses as he defined them. What he did not see was the transformation happening beneath my shock and humiliation. Something was crystallizing inside me, hard and clear as diamond. 4 years, I had managed my father's disapproval by trying to find middle ground, by hoping that time and patience would eventually win his acceptance. I had endured criticism, deflected insults directed at Daniel, and maintained family relationships at significant emotional cost. In that moment, standing in the venue foyer holding a torn check while my father waited for my surrender, I understood something fundamental about the dynamic between us. He did not want me to be happy. He wanted me to be obedient. My happiness, if it came through choices he did not approve, represented failure of his authority. The wedding was not really about Daniel or financial security or any of the rational concerns my father had articulated. It was about control. And he had just overplayed his hand. I looked at my father directly, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that surprised me. "You're right about one thing. This does end now." He nodded, misunderstanding my meaning entirely, assuming I was capitulating to his ultimatum. But I was not finished speaking. "It ends because I'm done pretending that your approval matters more than my life. You came here to humiliate me, to break something that was never yours to break. You wanted everyone here to witness my defeat. Instead, they're going to witness something else entirely." I turned and walked toward Melissa's office, my father calling after me with increasing anger, demanding that I return to finish our conversation. I ignored him and knocked on the glass partition. Melissa opened her door hesitantly, and I spoke clearly enough that my voice would carry back to where my father stood. "I apologize for the disruption. My father will be leaving now. Our contract remains in place. The wedding will proceed as planned. If he attempts to contact you or interfere in any way, please refer him to my attorney." I turned back toward my father, who had followed me across the foyer. His face had darkened with anger that he was struggling to contain in this semi-public space. I continued speaking, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "You wanted to stage an intervention. Consider this mine. You no longer have access to my finances, my decisions, or my life. The daughter you just humiliated is the same daughter who has spent years trying to earn respect you were never planning to give. That ended today. Not because you canceled anything, but because I am finally done seeking approval from someone who measures worth in dollars and status instead of character and love." I pulled out my phone and did something I should have done months earlier. I called my bank's customer service line, requested immediate closure of any accounts with Robert Mitchell's name attached, and arranged for all funds to be transferred to a new individual account. I did this while standing 3 feet from my father, making certain he understood that his access and his leverage were being eliminated in real time. When I finished the call, I picked up my planning folder from where I had left it on Melissa's desk. My father remained in the foyer, visibly struggling with the reality that his dramatic gesture had not produced the intended result. I walked past him without another word, pushed through the entrance doors, and stepped into the afternoon sunlight. My hands were still shaking. My heart was racing. But beneath the physical stress response, I felt something I had not experienced in years when dealing with my father. I felt powerful. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine, needing time to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. "Your father called. He's very upset. Can we please talk about this reasonably?" The message confirmed what I already suspected. She had known about his plans. Her convenient migraine had kept her away from the venue because she did not want to witness what my father intended to do. She had chosen his authority over my well-being, just as she had chosen it throughout my entire life. I responded to her message with clarity that came from finally understanding the complete picture of my family dynamics. "There is nothing to discuss. The wedding proceeds as planned. If Dad wants to attend, he can do so respectfully or not at all. The same applies to you. I'm done negotiating my happiness with people who see my choices as personal insults." The drive home took 20 minutes, but it felt like traveling a much greater distance. I was leaving behind the version of myself who had believed that patience and persistence would eventually break through my father's resistance. I was moving toward a version who understood that some people would never offer the acceptance I sought, and that their refusal said everything about them and nothing about my worth. When I arrived home, Daniel's car was already in the driveway. He had left school early after I texted him that we needed to talk. I found him in the kitchen, concern evident in his expression as I walked through the door. Before he could ask what happened, I started talking, describing the entire encounter without stopping, needing to release the words before the emotions they carried overwhelmed me. Daniel listened without interrupting, his face moving through shock, anger, and finally settling into something that looked like protective determination. When I finished recounting everything, he pulled me into an embrace that felt like the only solid thing in a world that had just shifted fundamentally. He did not offer solutions or strategies. He simply held me while I processed the reality that my father had chosen cruelty over connection, control over love. Later that evening, sitting at our small dining table with cups of tea cooling between us, Daniel asked the question I had been avoiding. Do you want to postpone the wedding? Not because of anything your father said, but because you need time to deal with this? I considered the question seriously. Part of me wanted to delay, to create space between the trauma of the afternoon and the joy that a wedding should represent. But another part, the part that was emerging stronger from the confrontation, knew that postponing would hand my father exactly what he wanted. It would confirm his power to disrupt my life. It would suggest that his approval, even in its absence, still controlled my decisions. No, I said finally. We're not postponing. We're not changing anything. He tried to break this and I refused to let him succeed. The wedding happens as planned, and it will be exactly what we designed it to be. A celebration of something real instead of something transactional. Daniel reached across the table and took my hand. Then that's what we do. And whatever comes next, we handle it together. What came next would test that commitment in ways neither of us anticipated. My father's public humiliation had been the opening move in what would become a sustained campaign to prove his point, to demonstrate that my defiance would carry consequences. But what he failed to understand was that his actions had not weakened me. They had clarified everything. For the first time in my adult life, I knew exactly where I stood and exactly what mattered. The wedding was 3 weeks away. The venue was secured. The guests were invited. And the daughter who had been called a joke was about to show her father and everyone else exactly what she was capable of building, when she finally stopped seeking permission to live her own life. The night after my father tore the check in the venue foyer, I could not sleep. I lay in bed watching shadows from the streetlight move across the ceiling, my mind replaying not just the afternoon's confrontation but years of smaller moments that suddenly arranged themselves into a coherent pattern. What I had previously categorized as isolated incidents of parental concern now revealed itself as systematic conditioning designed to ensure my compliance with his vision for my life. The recognition felt simultaneously devastating and liberating, like waking from a dream only to realize you had been dreaming for decades. I got up around 3 in the morning and opened my laptop at the kitchen table. Daniel had finally fallen asleep after we spent hours talking through immediate practical concerns about the wedding, but the conversation had only addressed surface logistics. The deeper work required solitary reflection, a systematic review of my relationship with my father from the perspective of someone who could finally see clearly. I created a document and began writing, not with any specific purpose but simply to externalize memories that were demanding examination. The earliest memory I recorded dated to my 7th birthday party. I had wanted a celebration at the community pool where my friends and I spent summer afternoons. My father had insisted on hosting at the country club, arguing that the facilities were superior and the event would allow important business contacts to meet his family. I remember standing in the formal dining room wearing a dress I found uncomfortable, watching children I barely knew eat cake while my actual friends attended a different party happening without me. When I expressed disappointment later, my father explained that I needed to understand that personal preferences sometimes mattered less than family obligations and social opportunities. At 7 years old, I learned that my desires were negotiable while his priorities were absolute. The pattern continued through childhood and adolescence with increasing sophistication. In middle school, I wanted to join the art club that met after school twice weekly. My father enrolled me in a youth business leadership program that required Saturday commitments and looked impressive on future college applications. When I protested, he framed the decision as investment in my future, suggesting that my preference for art demonstrated limited understanding of what would ultimately benefit me. The implicit message was clear. I could not be trusted to make decisions that served my own interests. He needed to guide me toward choices that reflected proper ambition and direction. High school brought escalating control disguised as parental involvement. My father reviewed my course selections each semester, redirecting me away from humanities electives I found interesting toward additional business and economics classes that would strengthen my college applications for the programs he had identified as appropriate. When I received admission to several universities, including one with an excellent social work program, he dismissed that option immediately, arguing that social work was a field for people who could not succeed in more demanding professions. He had already decided I would study business administration at his alma mater, where his substantial donations ensured favorable consideration of my application, and where his influence could continue shaping my trajectory. I documented dozens of similar incidents, each one insignificant when considered in isolation but revealing when examined as part of a comprehensive pattern. Every decision point in my life had become an opportunity for my father to assert his judgment over mine. Every expression of independent preference had been met with some combination of dismissal, redirection, or reframing that positioned his alternative as obviously superior. Over time, I had learned to anticipate his objections and preemptively adjust my stated desires toward options I believed he might accept. I had internalized his voice so completely that I was rejecting my own preferences before he even had the opportunity to do so. The pattern extended beyond major life decisions into everyday interactions. I noticed how family dinners followed scripts where my father controlled conversations, determined which topics deserved attention, and redirected discussions that moved in directions he found unproductive. I recalled how he would invite me to share opinions, but then systematically dismantle whatever perspective I offered, not through genuine intellectual engagement, but through rhetorical techniques designed to demonstrate the superiority of his thinking. These interactions were not dialogues but rather tutorials where I was meant to learn that his worldview represented reality, while mine represented naivete that experience would eventually correct. Financial control had been particularly insidious because it masqueraded as generosity. My father had established bank accounts for me, paid for education and living expenses, and provided supplementary funds for needs beyond my part-time work income. This support came with unspoken strings that only became visible when I attempted to make choices he opposed. The joint account he had access to obtain the check he destroyed at the venue was just one example of how his financial involvement created leverage he could deploy strategically. I realized he had maintained access to various accounts not because I needed his continued management, but because that access represented power to monitor and potentially constrain my choices. As I continued documenting patterns, I recognized how my mother's role had enabled my father's control, rather than providing any counterbalance. She had never directly contradicted his decisions or defended my autonomy when he overrode my preferences. Instead, she had functioned as his proxy, delivering his messages in softer tones that made them seem like concern rather than control. When I expressed frustration about his interference, she would counsel patience and understanding, explaining that he only wanted the best for me, and that his experience provided perspective I lacked. She had trained me to interpret his domination as protection, his dismissal of my judgment as wisdom, his inability to respect my autonomy as evidence of how much he cared. The dynamic with my brother Trevor reflected similar patterns. He had never questioned the prescribed path, had excelled at meeting every expectation, and had been rewarded with approval and financial support that continued into his adult life. My father had provided the down payment for Trevor's house, had made connections that accelerated his career progression, and spoke about him with pride that communicated clear comparison to my own disappointing trajectory. Trevor had never had to develop independence, because compliance had proven so rewarding. Our different approaches to dealing with our father had created distance between us. He viewed my resistance as unnecessary drama that disrupted family harmony, while I viewed his compliance as enabling behavior that allowed our father's control to continue unchallenged. The pattern recognition extended to how my father had handled my previous relationships. In college, I dated someone from a working-class background whose father was a mechanic. My father had never met him but had made numerous comments about the importance of shared socioeconomic backgrounds for relationship success. When that relationship ended for unrelated reasons, my father had expressed relief and offered observations about how I had fortunately avoided a serious mistake. In graduate school, I dated someone my father deemed acceptable, a law student from a family with social connections to his business network. That relationship had been actively encouraged through invitations to family events and comments about how we seemed well suited. When it ended because I realized we had nothing in common beyond backgrounds that satisfied external expectations, my father had been genuinely disappointed and had suggested I had sabotaged something promising due to unrealistic romantic idealism. The contrast between his response to relationships he approved and relationships he opposed revealed what actually mattered to him. He did not evaluate my partners based on how they treated me, whether we shared values, or whether the relationship contributed to my well-being and growth. He evaluated them based on how they reflected on him, whether they enhanced or diminished his family's social positioning, and whether they represented the kind of alliance that would integrate seamlessly into his worldview. My happiness was relevant only insofar as it aligned with his vision of appropriate choices. When it diverged from that vision, my happiness became evidence of poor judgment that needed correction. Daniel represented the ultimate challenge to this system, because he possessed qualities my father could not dismiss on grounds my father cared about while simultaneously failing every test my father considered important. Daniel was educated, articulate, professionally accomplished within his field, and demonstrably devoted to making positive contributions to the world. These qualities should have been admirable, but they were rendered irrelevant by his middle-class background, modest income, and career in a profession my father considered service work for people without better options. Daniel's actual character and our genuine compatibility meant nothing compared to the external markers my father used to evaluate worth. As dawn began lightening the sky outside the kitchen window, I had filled more than 20 pages with documented patterns spanning 2.5 decades. The document represented an autopsy of a relationship I had believed was normal parental involvement, until I finally had context to recognize it as systematic control. The revelation was painful but necessary. I could not respond effectively to my father's attempt to destroy my wedding without understanding the larger dynamic that had made such an action conceivable to him. I realized that the venue confrontation was not an aberration but rather an escalation. For years, my father had successfully controlled major life decisions through subtler methods. He had shaped my education, influenced my career choices, and maintained involvement in my financial life that created ongoing leverage. Those methods had worked because I had cooperated with them, believing that his involvement reflected normal parental guidance, rather than recognizing it as colonization of my autonomy. When I chose Daniel despite his sustained opposition, I broke the implicit contract that had governed our relationship. The engagement represented the first time I had made an irreversible choice that directly contradicted his judgment. The wedding represented the formalization of that defiance. His response was not about the wedding specifically but about reasserting control that my choice had challenged. Understanding this context transformed how I thought about the situation. I had initially framed the venue confrontation as my father behaving badly in a moment of frustration about my choice of partner. I now recognized it as a calculated escalation in a long-standing pattern, where my increasing autonomy threatened the system he had built. He had torn the check and humiliated me publicly because previous methods of control had failed to achieve the desired result. He was demonstrating that defiance would carry consequences, that choosing against his wishes would mean losing access to family resources and acceptance. The recognition crystallized a choice I needed to make. I could attempt to manage his behavior through appeasement, perhaps postponing the wedding or making symbolic concessions that might satisfy his need for control without completely sacrificing my autonomy. This approach would preserve family relationships and avoid open conflict, but it would also reinforce the dynamic that had constrained my life for years. Alternatively, I could treat his escalation as opportunity to finally establish genuine boundaries, accepting that this approach would likely create permanent rupture, but would also create space for building a life directed by my own values, rather than his expectations. The choice felt impossibly difficult when I considered it through the lens of family loyalty and the possibility of future reconciliation. But when I examined it through the lens of the patterns I had documented, the choice became clear. My father had shown me consistently across decades that he would not voluntarily accept my autonomy. He would always find ways to assert influence and would escalate pressure when influence failed. Appeasing him now would only delay the inevitable confrontation, while reinforcing his belief that sufficient pressure would ultimately bring me back into compliance. The only way to establish genuine independence was to accept the consequences he was threatening and demonstrate that those consequences no longer functioned as leverage. Daniel found me at the kitchen table around 6 in the morning, surrounded by printed pages covered with notes and highlighted passages. He read through several pages without comment, then sat down across from me with an expression that communicated understanding without requiring explanation. He understood what the document represented. It was evidence that my struggle was not about a single incident, but about finally extracting myself from a system of control that had shaped my entire life. We talked through implications for the immediate future. My father would not accept my defiance at the venue as final word. He would escalate through various channels, deploying my mother as intermediary, potentially involving other family members, and possibly creating obstacles beyond the financial interference he had already attempted. We needed to anticipate these escalations and prepare responses that maintained the boundaries I was establishing, rather than allowing incremental erosion of my position. The first practical step was completing the financial separation I had initiated at the venue. I spent that morning calling every financial institution where I had accounts, verifying exactly which accounts existed, confirming who had access to each one, and systematically closing or modifying any account that gave my father visibility into or control over my finances. The process revealed that his involvement was even more extensive than I had realized. He had been receiving monthly statements for accounts I had opened independently, had been listed as beneficiary on investment accounts I had established through my employer, and had apparently been monitoring my credit card activity through alerts he had set up years earlier that I had never thought to disable. Removing his access felt like dismantling surveillance infrastructure that had been operating invisibly for years. Each account I secured represented another area of my life that would no longer be subject to his observation and potential intervention. The process took most of the day, involved numerous phone calls and identity verification procedures, but by evening I had achieved complete financial independence for the first time in my adult life. The psychological impact was profound. I had not realized how much constant low-level anxiety I carried about his potential reactions to my spending decisions, until that anxiety disappeared when I knew he no longer had visibility into my financial life. The second practical step was communicating clearly with my mother. I called her that evening and outlined the boundaries I was establishing without inviting debate about whether those boundaries were necessary or appropriate. I explained that my father's behavior at the venue had been unacceptable, that his attempt to destroy my wedding would not succeed, and that moving forward I would maintain only those relationships with family members who could respect my autonomy and treat Daniel with basic courtesy. I told her that she could choose how she wanted to proceed, but that I would not negotiate about the wedding or my relationship. The conversation was brief and painful. She cycled through several predictable responses, suggesting I was overreacting, asking whether I had considered how much this was hurting my father, and finally warning that I was creating divisions that might never heal. I ended the call by repeating that the boundaries were not subject to discussion, and that I hoped she would choose to maintain our relationship within those parameters. The third step was informing extended family about the situation in a way that established my narrative before my father could deploy his own version of events. I drafted a message to aunts, uncles, and cousins who would likely be invited to the wedding, or would hear about the family conflict through other channels. The message was factual and restrained, explaining that my father and I had fundamental disagreements about my relationship and my choices, that he had taken actions to interfere with my wedding planning, and that while I hoped family members would celebrate with Daniel and me, I understood they might feel caught in the middle and would respect whatever decisions they made about attendance and involvement. The message deliberately avoided inflammatory language or detailed accusations, focusing instead on establishing that I was moving forward with my life, and welcoming those who wanted to be part of that forward movement. The responses to that message were revealing. Some family members replied with support and reassurance that they would definitely attend the wedding regardless of my father's opinions. Others sent cautious messages that acknowledged receiving the information without committing to any particular position. A few responded with versions of concern that sounded suspiciously similar to my mother's talking points, suggesting coordination about how to respond to my defiance. One uncle, my father's younger brother, sent a long message that was transparently intended to advocate for my father's position, while maintaining the appearance of neutrality. He suggested that strong personalities sometimes clash, but that family loyalty required working through disagreements, rather than allowing them to create permanent separation. The message frustrated me because it framed the situation as conflict between equal parties rather than recognizing the power differential and history of control that actually define the dynamic. I realized through these responses that some relationships would not survive the boundaries I was establishing. People who benefited from or depended on my father's approval would likely align with him rather than risk their own positions within the family system. Others who had their own complicated relationships with my father might privately support my independence while publicly maintaining neutrality to protect themselves. The wedding guest list would effectively sort family members into categories based on whether they could accept my choices, even when those choices contradicted my father's preferences. By the end of the first week after the venue confrontation, I had created practical infrastructure for independence while also beginning to process the emotional dimensions of what I was doing. I was not merely planning a wedding anymore. I was formally ending my participation in a family system that had constrained my development and would continue constraining me as long as I remained embedded in it. The decision brought grief alongside relief. I was losing the fantasy of eventually earning my father's genuine respect and acceptance. I was acknowledging that the parent I had wanted him to be was not the parent he was capable of being. That recognition was painful even when it was also necessary and overdue. Daniel and I spent evenings that week talking through not just logistics but meaning. He asked me repeatedly whether I was certain this was what I wanted, not because he doubted my decision but because he wanted me to have space to examine my motivations without pressure. I appreciated the questions because they forced me to distinguish between decisions driven by anger or pain and decisions driven by genuine commitment to building something different. The anger and pain were real, but they were not the foundation of my choice. The foundation was recognition that I deserved to build a life based on my own values, rather than spending decades trying to satisfy someone who had demonstrated he would never be satisfied unless I surrendered my autonomy entirely. The wedding remained 3 weeks away. The venue was secured, the guest list was sent, and the plans were proceeding despite my father's attempt to derail everything. But the wedding had become something larger than a celebration. It had become a statement about whether I would continue living according to someone else's script, or whether I would finally claim authorship of my own story. Every choice I made to move forward with plans my father opposed represented another declaration of independence. Every boundary I maintained against pressure to reconsider represented another investment in the future I was building, rather than the future that had been prescribed for me. The pattern recognition phase was painful but essential. I could not effectively respond to my father's actions without understanding the larger system those actions emerged from. I could not establish healthy boundaries without recognizing how systematically previous boundaries had been violated. I could not build genuine independence without acknowledging how comprehensively my development had been shaped by someone else's agenda. The work was difficult, but it created foundation for everything that would follow. I was finally seeing clearly, and clarity, even when painful, provides the necessary ground for transformation. The week following my systematic documentation of control patterns brought an unexpected revelation about the architecture of relationships that had surrounded me for years. I had assumed that family connections were the primary source of support, and that friends occupied a secondary tier of importance in navigating major life decisions. The reality that emerged as I established boundaries with my father revealed a completely different structure. The people I had categorized as peripheral were demonstrating loyalty and understanding that many family members could not or would not provide. This recognition forced me to reconsider fundamental assumptions about where genuine support originates, and what constitutes chosen family versus obligatory relationships. The first person to demonstrate unwavering support was my colleague Rachel Tomlin, who worked in the adjacent office at the nonprofit where I managed case services for foster youth. Rachel and I had developed a friendship over 3 years of working together, bonding initially over shared frustration with bureaucratic obstacles that prevented us from serving clients effectively, then deepening that connection through conversations that extended beyond professional concerns into personal territory. I had mentioned my father's opposition to my engagement in previous discussions, framing it as garden-variety parental concern about my choice of partner. After the venue confrontation, I needed to talk with someone outside the immediate situation who could provide perspective without the complicated loyalties that family members carried. I found Rachel in her office during lunch break the day after I had spent the morning securing my financial accounts. She took one look at my face and closed her office door, pulling an extra chair close to her desk and waiting for me to begin. I told her everything, starting with the venue confrontation and extending backward into the pattern recognition work I had completed. Rachel listened with the focused attention she typically reserved for client interviews where details mattered enormously, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly allowing me to process through speaking. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before responding with an observation that reframed my entire understanding of the situation. She told me that she had recognized signs of parental control in previous conversations, but had hesitated to name them directly, because people rarely respond well to outsiders critiquing family dynamics. She said that my description of my father's behavior aligned with patterns she observed in some of the families we worked with, where parents use financial dependence and emotional manipulation to maintain authority over adult children, long past the point where such authority was appropriate. She noted that my professional training had equipped me to recognize these dynamics in clients, but that personal involvement made it nearly impossible to see clearly when the patterns were shaping my own life. Her observation was not criticism but rather acknowledgement of how difficult it is to maintain objectivity about situations we are embedded within. Rachel offered practical support that proved invaluable. She helped me think through potential escalation scenarios and develop response strategies for each one. She role-played difficult conversations I anticipated having with family members, providing feedback about how my language might be received and suggesting alternative phrasings that maintained boundaries while minimizing unnecessary provocation. She reviewed the message I had drafted for extended family, offering minor revisions that strengthened clarity without increasing defensiveness. Most importantly, she provided consistent affirmation that my responses were reasonable, and that establishing independence from controlling dynamics was healthy rather than rebellious or disrespectful. The contrast between Rachel's support and my mother's response was striking. My mother called repeatedly during those first days, each conversation following a similar script where she expressed concern about family unity, suggested I was being unnecessarily harsh in my judgment of my father's actions, and implied that my choices were creating pain for everyone involved. She never asked how I was managing emotionally, or whether I needed support navigating a situation that my father had created. Her concern was directed entirely toward maintaining the family system and minimizing disruption to established patterns. Rachel, who had no obligation to involve herself in my personal crisis, offered exactly the support my mother could not provide because Rachel's loyalty was to my well-being rather than to preserving dynamics that served my father's need for control. The second source of unexpected support came from Daniel's family, particularly his mother Sophia and his younger sister Elena. I had met them multiple times over the course of our relationship, and had been welcomed warmly despite obvious differences in socioeconomic backgrounds and life experiences. Sophia worked as a nurse at a public hospital, managing night shifts that allowed her to maintain the house she had purchased after her divorce years earlier. Elena was completing her teaching credential, while working as a substitute teacher in the same district where Daniel taught. Their lives reflected values I admired, but that my father dismissed as evidence of limited ambition. When I called Sophia to explain that my father had attempted to sabotage the wedding, and that family dynamics were complicated, she listened quietly, and then said something that made me understand why Daniel had developed into the person I loved. She told me that family was not defined by biology, but by commitment to each other's growth and happiness. She said that her door was always open and that whatever I needed during this difficult period, whether practical help with wedding preparation or simply space away from conflict, I should not hesitate to ask. The offer was genuine rather than performative, and I found myself accepting it in ways I had not anticipated. Over the following week, I spent several evenings at Sophia's house, sometimes helping Elena prepare lesson plans for her substitute assignments, sometimes sitting with Sophia while she prepared meals before her night shifts, sometimes simply existing in a household where affection was expressed directly rather than mediated through conditions and expectations. The contrast with my family of origin was profound. In my parents' house, conversation was often strategic, with subtext matching more than stated content. In Sophia's house, people said what they meant and addressed conflict directly rather than allowing resentment to accumulate beneath polite surfaces. I observed how Daniel had learned to communicate with emotional honesty, how he had developed capacity for genuine partnership rather than transactional relationships. He had been shaped by a family system that valued authenticity over appearance, and that foundation was exactly what allowed him to meet my father's hostility without internalizing it as commentary on his worth. Elena became an unexpected ally in practical wedding preparation. When I mentioned that my mother had been supposed to help coordinate certain logistical details but had withdrawn that support in response to my father's demands, Elena volunteered to step in. She took over communication with the florist, organized transportation logistics for guests traveling from out of town, and created a detailed timeline for the day of coordination that even Melissa, the professional wedding coordinator, praised for its thoroughness. Elena approached these tasks with genuine enthusiasm, treating the wedding as celebration rather than obligation. Her involvement represented more than practical help. It demonstrated that family support could be chosen and offered freely rather than contingent on compliance with particular expectations. The third source of support emerged from my professional network, particularly from individuals I had worked with on foster care reform initiatives. When the message I sent to extended family inevitably circulated more widely, several colleagues reached out privately to share their own experiences with family estrangement or difficult decisions to prioritize personal well-being over family expectations. A woman named Jennifer Park, who directed a sister organization focused on youth housing, sent a long email describing her own decision to limit contact with parents who could not accept her identity as a queer woman. She wrote about the grief of losing the family she had wanted while simultaneously experiencing relief and growth that came from building life on her own terms. Her message acknowledged the complexity of my situation without trying to minimize the pain or rush me toward resolution. Another colleague, Marcus Washington, who had testified with me before state legislative committees about needed policy changes, called to check in and ended up sharing his experience of navigating family dynamics after marrying someone his parents deemed inappropriate due to religious differences. He described years of attempting to maintain connection while constantly managing his parents' inability to accept his choices, and the eventual decision to establish firmer boundaries that allowed him to preserve his marriage without constantly defending it. His perspective was particularly valuable because he had walked the path I was beginning, and he could describe both the immediate difficulty and the long-term benefits of prioritizing partnership over parental approval. These conversations revealed something important about support systems. The people who offered the most meaningful assistance were not necessarily those with the closest proximity or longest history. They were people who had developed capacity to witness struggle without trying to fix it, to offer perspective without imposing judgment, and to respect autonomy while providing practical help. Many of them had navigated their own versions of choosing authenticity over expectation, and their willingness to share those experiences provided roadmap for territory I was traveling without clear directions. The wedding planning itself became a vehicle for identifying who could offer genuine support versus who remained loyal to family systems that required my compliance. My maid of honor, my college roommate Jessica Chen, had always been someone I trusted completely. After the venue confrontation, she flew in from Seattle where she had relocated for work, taking vacation days to spend time helping with final wedding preparations. Jessica had witnessed my relationship with my father during our years living together, had observed patterns I was only now fully recognizing, and had apparently been waiting for me to reach the point where I could see clearly what had always been visible to her from outside the dynamic. Jessica brought both emotional support and practical assistance. She accompanied me to final dress fittings, helped organize guest accommodations, and served as buffer when my mother attempted to engage me in conversations designed to pressure reconsideration of my boundaries. More significantly, Jessica helped me process the grief that was emerging alongside the anger and determination. She recognized that I was not merely planning a wedding, but simultaneously mourning the loss of family relationships I had hoped might eventually become healthy. She created space for that mourning without suggesting it meant I should reverse the boundaries I was establishing. Other friends from different life stages emerged with various forms of support. A graduate school classmate who had moved to the area offered her guest room as temporary refuge if I needed space away from conflict. A former supervisor who had become a friend sent a gift certificate for a massage with a note acknowledging that stress management during difficult family situations was essential self-care. A neighbor who had noticed tension during a recent interaction offered to help with any practical needs that might arise as the wedding approached. These gestures were individually small, but collectively created a network of support that demonstrated I was not isolated despite my father's attempt to use potential isolation as leverage. The support system that materialized during this period also revealed painful truths about relationships I had assumed were solid. Several people I had considered close friends responded to news of the family conflict with versions of concern that actually functioned as pressure to reconcile. They sent messages suggesting that family rifts were tragic and avoidable, that surely there was middle ground where both my father and I could feel heard, that weddings were not worth permanent estrangement. These responses came from good intentions but reflected fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. They assumed conflict between equals rather than recognizing power differential and pattern of control. They prioritized appearance of family unity over my actual well-being. Their inability to support boundaries I was establishing revealed that those relationships had been more superficial than I had recognized. The most painful revelation involved my brother Trevor. I had hoped that despite his general alignment with my father's values, Trevor might find space to support me as his sister even if he disagreed with my choices. Instead, Trevor sent a message that read like legal brief arguing my father's position. He outlined reasons why my response was disproportionate to my father's actions, suggested I was being manipulated by Daniel into alienating family, and warned that I was making decisions I would later regret. The message hurt not because Trevor sided with our father, but because it revealed that Trevor had so thoroughly internalized our father's worldview that he could not access independent perspective or loyalty to our sibling relationship that transcended parental approval. I responded to Trevor's message with clarity that our relationship would remain distant until he could interact with me without serving as proxy for our father's positions. I explained that I understood his choice to maintain alignment with family systems that rewarded his compliance, but that I could not maintain close relationship with someone who consistently invalidated my experiences and judgment. Trevor did not reply, and his silence communicated that preserving his position within the family hierarchy mattered more than preserving connection with me. The recognition was sad but also clarifying. I could stop investing energy in relationship that Trevor was unwilling to prioritize. As the wedding approached, the support system that had materialized looked nothing like what I had anticipated when Daniel and I first began planning. My father would not attend. My mother had confirmed she would also stay away, framing this decision as necessity rather than choice, as though supporting her husband's position was obligation that overrode her relationship with me. Trevor sent notification that he and his wife would not attend, citing concerns about creating family division. Several aunts and uncles who had initially indicated they would celebrate with us quietly withdrew their RSVPs as the situation became more public and my father's opposition more clear. The guest list that remained included Daniel's entire extended family, who had welcomed me completely and treated the wedding as joyous occasion rather than political statement. It included friends from various life stages who understood that supporting someone's autonomy sometimes meant witnessing them make choices that created conflict with family expectations. It included colleagues who recognized patterns of control from their professional work and could name what they were observing without minimizing its impact. It included my grandmother's sister, my great-aunt Margaret, who sent a note saying she had watched my father attempt to control his children for decades and was proud that I had finally established boundaries she wished she had helped me establish earlier. The reconfigured support system taught me essential lessons about relationships and loyalty. Biology creates connection but not obligation. Shared history provides context but not authority. Family titles like parent or sibling describe relationships, but do not define their quality or guarantee their health. The people who demonstrated capacity to support me during this crisis were people who valued my autonomy and well-being above their comfort or their position within family systems. They were people who could witness me making difficult choices without trying to redirect me toward easier paths that would require betraying my own judgment. Sophia told me during one of our conversations at her house that the family we choose is often more sustaining than the family we are born into. Not because biology is meaningless, but because chosen relationships are based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than obligation and conditioning. She said that Daniel and I were not just getting married, but were beginning the process of building our own family system grounded in different values than the one I was leaving behind. She reminded me that this process would involve grief for what I was losing alongside excitement for what I was creating, and that both emotions were valid and necessary. The support system that emerged during those weeks before the wedding provided practical assistance, with logistics and emotional validation during moments of doubt. More fundamentally, it demonstrated that I could survive and even thrive outside the family system that had shaped my first 3 decades of life. The people who showed up for me during crisis were showing me what healthy relationships looked like, relationships based on reciprocity rather than hierarchy, on authentic connection rather than strategic alliance, on respect for autonomy rather than demand for compliance. They were teaching me through their actions what Daniel had been teaching me through our partnership, that love did not require surrendering selfhood, and that support did not require agreement about every choice. As the final week before the wedding arrived, I felt simultaneously exhausted and energized. The emotional work of establishing boundaries, processing grief, and navigating family crisis had been depleting. But I was also experiencing clarity and purpose that came from finally living according to my own values, rather than performing roles that others had assigned. The support system that had materialized was smaller than I had once imagined my wedding celebration would include, but it was also more genuine. Every person who would be present had chosen to be there, had demonstrated through actions rather than merely words that they supported not just the wedding but the autonomy and partnership the wedding represented. The discovery of who stands with you during crisis is a gift, even when it reveals painful truths about relationships you thought were solid. It creates opportunity to invest energy in connections that actually nourish, rather than deplete. It allows you to stop performing for audiences that will never offer genuine approval. It clarifies which relationships are based on who you actually are versus who others want you to be. The support system that emerged during this period became foundation for the life I was building, and that foundation was stronger for being chosen rather than inherited. The decision to establish clear boundaries with my father had been necessary and overdue, but I had underestimated his determination to prove that defiance would carry consequences severe enough to force my capitulation. The week that followed my financial separation and communication with extended family brought escalations that revealed the full extent of his willingness to deploy any available leverage to reassert control. Each new attempt to interfere or punish demonstrated that he viewed my autonomy not as natural development but as rebellion that required correction. Understanding his tactics and developing effective responses became essential to protecting both the wedding and the foundation of independence I was building. The first escalation arrived through my workplace. On Monday morning, I received a message from our executive director, Dr. Patricia Blackwell, requesting a meeting in her office that afternoon. The tone was formal rather than friendly, which immediately signaled that something was wrong. Patricia and I had worked together for 4 years developing programs that improved outcomes for foster youth transitioning to independent living. Our relationship had always been collaborative and respectful, characterized by mutual trust and shared commitment to the organization's mission. The sudden formality suggested external pressure had entered our professional dynamic. When I arrived at her office, Patricia's expression communicated discomfort with whatever conversation she needed to initiate. She began by emphasizing that she valued my contributions to the organization and had complete confidence in my professional capabilities. The preamble immediately indicated that a significant concern would follow. She explained that my father had contacted the board of directors over the weekend, ostensibly to discuss potential major donation to support our programming. During that conversation, he had raised concerns about my judgment and emotional stability, suggesting that personal issues were affecting my professional performance and potentially compromising my work with vulnerable youth. The strategy was sophisticated and vindictive. My father knew that my professional identity was central to my sense of purpose and accomplishment. By introducing doubt about my competence into my workplace, he was attacking something he knew mattered to me deeply, while simultaneously creating pressure that extended beyond family dynamics into my career stability. He was demonstrating that defying him would carry costs that reached into every area of my life, that establishing independence would mean losing the professional reputation I had built over years of dedicated work. Patricia assured me that the board had not taken his concerns at face value, and that my job was not in jeopardy. However, she needed to address the situation directly to ensure there were no legitimate performance issues that required attention or support. The conversation required me to disclose personal circumstances I had intended to keep separate from my professional life. I explained the family conflict over my wedding, my father's attempt to sabotage the celebration, and the boundaries I had established in response to his interference. I provided context about patterns of control that had characterized our relationship, and framed his contact with the board as retaliation for my refusal to comply with his demands, rather than legitimate concern about my professional capabilities. Patricia listened carefully, and then shared information that reframed my understanding of the situation. She told me that my father's approach had been more calculated than his stated concern suggested. He had not simply raised questions about my performance. He had specifically referenced several cases I had managed, claiming to have information about client complaints and procedural violations that supposedly demonstrated my diminished capacity to handle responsibilities effectively. The claims were fabrications, but they were detailed enough to require investigation and response. My father had done research into my caseload and had constructed allegations that sounded plausible enough to create doubt, knowing that any investigation would consume time and energy, while potentially damaging my professional reputation, regardless of the ultimate findings. The recognition that my father had weaponized my professional work, that he had deliberately attempted to undermine my credibility in the field where I had built expertise and contributed meaningfully, represented a new level of betrayal. This was not simply a parent disagreeing with his daughter's choices. This was strategic sabotage designed to destabilize multiple areas of my life simultaneously to demonstrate that independence would be unsustainable. The revelation clarified something important about the nature of the conflict. My father was not trying to protect me from a mistake as he had claimed. He was trying to punish me for disloyalty by proving that life outside his control would collapse under pressures he could orchestrate. Patricia's response to the situation demonstrated the value of having established professional credibility through consistent ethical work. She told me that she had reviewed my cases thoroughly before our meeting, had spoken with supervisors and colleagues about my performance, and had found no evidence supporting any of the concerns my father had raised. She had informed the board that his contact appeared to be personal retaliation rather than legitimate whistleblowing, and that the organization would not allow family conflicts to be weaponized against staff members. She advised me to document the incident and consider whether my father's behavior constituted harassment that might require legal response, but she assured me that my position was secure, and that she would not allow external interference to affect my work environment. The conversation left me simultaneously grateful for Patricia's support and shaken by my father's willingness to attack my professional life. I had anticipated that he might escalate pressure through family channels or attempt to interfere with wedding logistics, but I had not imagined he would target my career. The incident revealed that no aspect of my life would be protected from his retaliation, as long as I maintained boundaries that contradicted his authority. The recognition was frightening but also clarifying. It confirmed that any attempt to preserve partial connection with him, while maintaining autonomy, would be impossible. He would continue finding pressure points until I either capitulated completely or established distance comprehensive enough to eliminate his access to vulnerable areas of my life. The second escalation arrived through financial channels despite my efforts to secure all accounts. I discovered on Tuesday that my father had contacted my landlord, a property management company that handled the apartment complex where Daniel and I lived. He had identified himself as my father, expressed concern about my ability to maintain rent payments due to personal difficulties, and offered to guarantee my lease personally to prevent any potential issues. The offer sounded generous on its surface, but the actual intent was transparent. By inserting himself as guarantor on my housing, he would create ongoing financial connection that gave him leverage and information about my living situation. He would know if rent was paid late, would receive communications about lease renewals, and would position himself as responsible party whose involvement was necessary for my residential stability. The property management company had apparently been receptive to the offer, until they contacted me to discuss terms. When I explained that I had not requested this arrangement and specifically did not want my father involved in my housing situation, the leasing agent seemed confused. She noted that most tenants would appreciate having additional financial backing, especially when offered by family members with substantial assets. Her confusion was understandable, because she was interpreting the situation through conventional assumptions about family relationships and parental support. She could not see what was obvious to me, that the offer was not help but rather attempted colonization of another area of my life where I had established independence. I spent Tuesday afternoon reviewing my lease agreement, confirming that my father had no legal standing to modify terms without my consent, and sending formal written communication to the property management company stating that any contact from Robert Mitchell regarding my tenancy should be refused, and that I did not authorize him to guarantee, modify, or receive information about my lease. The necessity of taking these protective measures felt exhausting and absurd. I was having to defend basic boundaries that should have been automatically respected, having to explicitly refuse assistance that was designed as surveillance rather than support. The third escalation targeted the wedding directly through vendors I had contracted with for the celebration. On Wednesday, the photographer I had hired, a woman named Amanda Torres who came highly recommended, and whose portfolio demonstrated exactly the aesthetic I wanted, sent an anxious email asking whether the wedding was still happening. She explained that someone claiming to be my father had contacted her office, informed her that the wedding was being postponed indefinitely due to family emergency, and suggested that she should not expect payment for services since the event would not proceed as planned. Amanda was understandably concerned because she had blocked the date on her calendar, had turned down other bookings for that weekend, and needed clarity about whether the contract remained valid. I immediately called Amanda to confirm that the wedding was absolutely proceeding as scheduled, that my father had no authority to cancel or modify arrangements, and that she should disregard any communication from him. I asked whether he had contacted her personally or through other means, and she explained that the call had come from a woman who identified herself as my father's assistant, which suggested he was involving his business infrastructure in his campaign to sabotage the wedding. I provided Amanda with written confirmation of our contract terms, and assured her that full payment would be delivered as agreed regardless of any interference attempts. The realization that my father was systematically contacting vendors introduced new concerns about what other interference might be underway. I spent Wednesday evening calling every vendor involved in the wedding: the florist, the caterer, the DJ, the transportation service, and the bakery producing our cake. I informed each one that only communication directly from me or from Melissa, the venue coordinator, should be considered authoritative regarding the wedding plans. I explained that there was family conflict, and that someone might attempt to cancel or modify arrangements without authorization. Most vendors were understanding and appreciated the advance warning, though several seemed bewildered that a parent would actively try to sabotage their child's wedding. The florist, an older man named George Castillo who had been designing wedding flowers for 30 years, expressed particular concern after I explained the situation. He told me that in his decades of experience, he had occasionally encountered family drama around weddings, but he had never seen a parent attempt to destroy their child's celebration through systematic interference with vendors. He assured me that he would require written authorization with identity verification before making any changes to our order, and that he would contact me immediately if anyone attempted to modify arrangements. His solidarity was touching, but the necessity of having this conversation with someone I had hired for their artistic expertise rather than their security protocols felt surreal. The fourth escalation involved my extended family and demonstrated my father's willingness to deploy social pressure through every available channel. Throughout Thursday and Friday, I received messages from various aunts, uncles, and cousins that followed suspiciously similar scripts. Each message expressed concern about the rift developing in the family, suggested that I was being unreasonable in my response to my father's legitimate parental concerns, and implied that my actions were causing unnecessary pain for everyone involved. The messages were carefully calibrated to avoid explicitly siding with my father, while consistently positioning me as the source of conflict and my boundaries as disproportionate response to his behavior. The coordination was obvious enough that I suspected my father had orchestrated a campaign where he provided talking points to various family members, who then delivered those messages as though expressing their own independent concerns. The strategy was effective because it created impression of consensus, as though multiple people had independently arrived at the conclusion that I was overreacting and needed to reconsider my position. The social pressure was designed to make me feel isolated and unreasonable, to suggest that everyone could see my response was excessive except me, and to leverage my desire for family connection to pressure capitulation. I developed a standard response to these messages that acknowledged receipt without engaging with the substance of their arguments. I explained that I had established boundaries necessary for my well-being, that those boundaries were not subject to negotiation or debate, and that I understood if family members felt uncomfortable with the situation but could not modify my decisions to alleviate their discomfort. The response was polite but firm, designed to close down continued pressure without creating additional conflict. Some family members accepted this boundary and stopped sending pressuring messages. Others persisted with increasingly direct arguments that eventually required me to stop responding entirely. The most painful message in this category came from my grandmother, my father's mother, who I had always felt close to despite her son's controlling behavior. She called Friday evening and began by saying she loved me and wanted me to be happy. Then she transitioned into a speech that sounded rehearsed, explaining that my father was a good man who had always provided for his family, that he had high standards because he wanted the best for his children, and that my current conflict with him was breaking his heart. She suggested that I should consider postponing the wedding to allow time for emotions to settle, and for the family to work through disagreements without the pressure of an imminent celebration that would formalize the division. Her message hurt because it came from someone I had believed understood me and valued our relationship independently of my father's influence. The realization that even my grandmother was either unable or unwilling to acknowledge the problematic nature of my father's behavior, that she would advocate for postponing my wedding to spare him discomfort rather than supporting my right to celebrate my marriage on my own terms, clarified how comprehensively his narrative had colonized family perceptions. I responded to my grandmother with more emotion than I had shown in other similar conversations, explaining that I loved her but could not accept her characterization of the situation. I told her that postponing my wedding to manage my father's feelings would betray both myself and Daniel, and that I hoped she could find a way to celebrate with us despite her concerns but would understand if she chose not to attend. The accumulation of escalations throughout that week created stress that affected my physical health in measurable ways. I was sleeping poorly, waking multiple times each night with anxiety about what new interference might emerge. My appetite was diminished, and I was losing weight at a time when I needed to maintain strength for the final wedding preparations and the emotional demands of the situation. I was experiencing tension headaches that occasionally escalated to migraines, physical manifestations of the sustained stress I was managing. Daniel noticed these symptoms and insisted that I needed to prioritize self-care, alongside the crisis management that was consuming my energy. We established evening routines designed to create separation between the conflict and our relationship. We instituted a rule that after 8 o'clock each evening, we would not discuss my father or wedding interference unless emergency response was required. Instead, we would cook dinner together, watch shows that had nothing to do with family drama, or simply sit together reading while maintaining physical contact that reinforced our partnership. These boundaries around our personal time were essential for preventing the conflict from completely colonizing our relationship and our mental space. Rachel, my colleague who had been providing consistent support, suggested that I might benefit from speaking with a therapist who specialized in family systems and boundary setting. She provided a referral to someone she knew professionally, a woman named Dr. Lauren Miyamoto who had extensive experience working with adults navigating separation from controlling or abusive family dynamics. I was initially resistant to the suggestion because seeking therapy felt like admitting that my father's actions were succeeding in destabilizing me. Rachel gently challenged that interpretation, pointing out that therapy was not evidence of weakness, but rather strategic use of professional support to navigate an objectively difficult situation more effectively. I scheduled an emergency session with Dr. Miyamoto for Saturday morning. The conversation provided external validation that proved essential for maintaining clarity about the situation. Dr. Miyamoto listened to my description of the week's escalations and then provided professional assessment that named what was happening with precision I had been avoiding. She explained that my father's behavior fit established patterns of what family systems therapists recognize as coercive control, where one family member uses various forms of pressure, manipulation, and punishment to maintain authority over another family member's choices and autonomy. She noted that his willingness to attack my professional reputation and systematically interfere with vendors demonstrated that his priority was reasserting control rather than preserving relationship or ensuring my well-being. Dr. Miyamoto helped me develop a framework for responding to ongoing escalations that conserved my energy while maintaining necessary boundaries. She suggested documenting every interference attempt with dates, descriptions, and any evidence available, creating a comprehensive record that might become necessary if legal intervention was eventually required. She recommended limiting my exposure to family members who were serving as proxies for my father's pressure campaign, recognizing that repeated engagement with their messages was depleting my resources without producing any benefit. She validated my decision to proceed with the wedding as planned, noting that postponing would reinforce my father's belief that sufficient pressure would achieve his objectives and would delay rather than resolve the underlying conflict. The session helped me recognize that the escalations, while stressful and disruptive, were actually evidence that my boundaries were working. My father was escalating precisely because his previous methods of control had failed. He was deploying increasingly aggressive tactics because he recognized that I was serious about establishing independence. His behavior was unpleasant and required active management, but it did not indicate that I should modify my approach. Instead, it confirmed that maintaining firm boundaries was necessary, because any weakness would be exploited as opportunity to reassert the control I was working to escape. By the end of that week, I had developed systems for managing interference that reduced its impact on my daily functioning. I had protective measures in place with vendors, clear communication established with my workplace, and explicit boundaries set with family members who were attempting to pressure reconsideration of my decisions. I had professional support from Dr. Miyamoto and practical support from Daniel, Rachel, and the network of friends who were actively helping with final wedding preparations. The escalations had been difficult to navigate, but they had not achieved my father's objective of forcing my capitulation or preventing the wedding from proceeding. The experience taught me important lessons about the nature of boundary setting with people who are deeply invested in maintaining control. Establishing boundaries is rarely accepted gracefully by those who benefit from their absence. People who have exercised authority without challenge will typically escalate pressure when that authority is first contested, testing whether the person establishing boundaries has genuine commitment to maintaining them or whether sufficient discomfort will produce retreat. The escalation phase is often the most difficult period because it requires sustaining boundaries while managing intensified pressure, designed specifically to overwhelm resistance. However, successfully navigating escalation creates foundation for longer-term change. Each interference attempt that failed to modify my decisions demonstrated to my father that his tactics were no longer effective. Each boundary I maintained despite pressure reinforced my own understanding that independence was sustainable, even when it was uncomfortable. The week had been exhausting and occasionally frightening, but it had also been clarifying. I now understood exactly what I was dealing with and exactly what maintaining autonomy would require. The wedding was 1 week away, and despite every attempt at sabotage, it was going to happen exactly as Daniel and I had planned. The final week before the wedding arrived with the weight of everything that had preceded it, and the promise of transformation that would follow. I stood at a threshold between the life I had been conditioned to accept and the life I was choosing to create, between patterns established over decades and possibilities that required courage to pursue. The escalations from my father had clarified the stakes and confirmed the necessity of the boundaries I had established. Now the work shifted from defending against interference to actively building the celebration that would mark the beginning of my marriage and the formalization of my independence. This transition from reactive crisis management to proactive creation required a different kind of energy, one focused on joy and intentionality, rather than protection and resistance. Sunday morning, 6 days before the ceremony, Daniel and I drove to the Riverside estate for a final walkthrough with Melissa, the venue coordinator who had witnessed my father's initial attempt at sabotage. The gardens had transformed since that traumatic afternoon 3 weeks earlier. The late spring weather had coaxed the climbing roses into full bloom along the pergola where we would exchange vows. The lawn where guests would gather for the reception had been manicured to emerald perfection, and the string lights that would illuminate the evening celebration had been tested and hung with precision that created magical atmosphere, even in daylight. The physical space reflected none of the conflict that had surrounded its preparation, and that separation between the beauty we were creating and the dysfunction we were navigating felt significant. Melissa greeted us with warmth that communicated solidarity beyond her professional obligations. She had taken my warnings about potential interference seriously, and had implemented additional security measures to ensure that the day would proceed without disruption. She had briefed all venue staff about the situation, established protocols for verifying any last-minute changes, and arranged for discreet security presence that could manage any unwanted arrivals without creating scene that would distract from the celebration. Her thoroughness reflected understanding that this wedding represented more than typical celebration, and her commitment to protecting what Daniel and I were building moved me deeply. We reviewed the timeline for the day with attention to details that would create the experience we envisioned. The ceremony would begin in late afternoon, time to catch the golden light that would filter through the oak trees surrounding the garden. Guests would arrive beginning at 4 o'clock, greeted with champagne and light refreshments while a string quartet played classical selections we had chosen together. The ceremony itself would be brief and personal, with vows we had written ourselves that spoke to the partnership we were building and the values we shared. Following the ceremony, guests would move to the adjacent lawn for reception that would include dinner, dancing, and celebration that extended into the evening under the stars and string lights. Every element of the celebration reflected choices Daniel and I had made together based on what mattered to us, rather than what would impress others or meet external expectations. The flowers were seasonal and locally sourced, arranged in compositions that emphasized natural beauty over formal extravagance. The menu featured dishes from both our cultural backgrounds, honoring the blending of families and traditions that the marriage represented. The music would range from classical to contemporary, selected to encourage dancing and joy, rather than to demonstrate sophisticated taste. The wedding favors were donations made in each guest's name to the literacy program where Daniel volunteered, transforming the conventional gesture into contribution to work that reflected our shared commitment to education and opportunity. As we walked through the venue space imagining how the day would unfold, I felt tension I had been carrying for weeks begin to release. The interference and escalations had consumed enormous energy, but they had not prevented us from creating something beautiful and meaningful. The celebration would be smaller than originally planned due to family members who had chosen alignment with my father over attendance, but it would be more genuine because every person present would be there by choice rather than obligation. The absence of my parents and brother would be painful, but it would also be clarifying. The day would demonstrate what was possible when decisions were guided by authenticity, rather than fear of disapproval. Monday brought the arrival of Daniel's extended family, who were traveling from various locations to attend the wedding. His mother Sophia had coordinated housing for relatives who needed accommodations, transforming the logistics of their visit into opportunity for family gathering that began before the ceremony itself. Monday evening, we hosted an informal dinner at a local restaurant where both families were supposed to meet and celebrate together before the wedding day. The absence of my family at this dinner created awkwardness that Daniel's relatives navigated with grace, filling the space with warmth and enthusiasm that partially compensated for the obvious gaps at the table. Daniel's grandmother, a woman in her 80s named Rosa who had traveled from across the country despite health challenges that made the journey difficult, took my hand during dinner and spoke words that addressed the situation without requiring explanation. She told me that family was not about perfection or obligation, but about showing up for the people we love when presence matters most. She said that the people gathered around this table had chosen to celebrate with us, and that choice carried more meaning than any connection based on mere biology or social convention. Her words provided permission to focus on what was present rather than grieving what was absent, to celebrate the support we had rather than mourning the support we lacked. The dinner extended late into the evening as Daniel's relatives shared stories about his childhood, his development into the person I loved, and their observations about our relationship that revealed how much they valued what we had built together. His Aunt Carmen described watching Daniel transform when we began dating, noticing how he became more confident and settled, how he talked about future with certainty that had been absent in previous relationships. His uncle Javier joked about how Daniel had described me after our first date, noting that he had called his mother immediately to say he had met someone extraordinary. These stories created narrative about our relationship that centered our genuine connection, rather than external measures of compatibility, and they reminded me why I had chosen this partnership despite the costs that choice had carried. Tuesday was designated for final preparations that required attention to practical details. Jessica, my maid of honor, had arrived the previous evening and had taken charge of coordinating various tasks that needed completion before the ceremony. She managed final confirmations with vendors, picked up the wedding rings from the jeweler where they had been sized, collected our marriage license from the county clerk's office, and organized the welcome bags for out-of-town guests that contained local recommendations and small gifts. Her efficiency freed me to focus on emotional preparation and self-care, rather than logistics that would have consumed the entire day. I spent Tuesday afternoon with Sophia and Elena at a spa that Rachel had recommended, accepting their gift of massages and facials that addressed the physical toll of weeks spent managing crisis. The hours of forced relaxation felt strange initially because I had become so accustomed to operating in heightened alert mode, constantly anticipating the next interference or escalation. Learning to release that tension and simply be present in my body without scanning for threats required conscious effort, but it was essential work. Elena joked that she was ensuring I would look relaxed in wedding photos regardless of what stress I was managing internally, but the care behind the humor was obvious. She was creating space for me to experience peace before a day that would carry significant emotional complexity. Tuesday evening brought the rehearsal dinner, traditionally hosted by the groom's family but transformed in our case into gathering organized by Sophia with contributions from various friends who wanted to participate in the celebration. The dinner took place at a small Italian restaurant that Daniel and I had frequented throughout our relationship, a place where the staff knew us and where the atmosphere was warm rather than formal. The intimate setting felt appropriate for the moment, allowing everyone involved in the ceremony to understand their roles and timing, while also creating opportunity for toasts and expressions of support that grounded us before the actual wedding day. The rehearsal itself was straightforward because the ceremony we had designed was simple and personal rather than elaborate. We practiced the processional, confirmed positioning for the wedding party, and reviewed the structure of vows and ring exchange. The officiant, a friend of Daniel's who had been ordained specifically to perform our ceremony, walked us through each element with combination of reverence and lightness that set exactly the tone we wanted. He understood that the ceremony was sacred because of what it represented rather than because of formal religious structure, and his approach honored both the seriousness of the commitment and the joy of the celebration. During the dinner that followed, multiple people offered toasts that spoke to different aspects of our relationship and the circumstances surrounding the wedding. Jessica spoke about witnessing my growth over the years we had been friends, about watching me develop courage to prioritize my own happiness, and about her certainty that Daniel and I would build extraordinary life together. Sophia welcomed me into Daniel's family with words that acknowledged the complexity of my family situation without dwelling on it, emphasizing instead that family was defined by mutual care and respect rather than by titles or biological connection. Daniel's sister Elena spoke about the example our relationship provided for her about what partnership could look like when built on genuine equality and shared values rather than on convenience or external approval. When Daniel stood to offer his toast, he departed from the conventional format of thanking parents and acknowledging family support. Instead, he spoke directly to me about what the past weeks had revealed about our capacity to navigate difficulty together. He acknowledged that the path to this wedding had been more challenging than either of us anticipated, that we had faced opposition and interference that tested our commitment and our resolve. He said that every obstacle had actually strengthened his certainty about our decision, because it had demonstrated how we responded to pressure as team, rather than as individuals pursuing separate interests. He expressed gratitude not just for my choice to marry him, but for my courage to build life guided by our shared values, rather than by fear of disappointing people who could not or would not support our happiness. His words moved several people to tears, myself included, because they named what we had endured without positioning us as victims. He framed the difficulty as evidence of strength rather than as tragedy, as clarification rather than as loss. His perspective helped shift my own understanding of the situation. I had been viewing the conflict with my father as an unfortunate obstacle to overcome before we could begin our marriage. Daniel's framing suggested that navigating this conflict together was actually part of beginning our marriage, that we were already demonstrating the partnership that the ceremony would formalize. Wednesday brought unexpected gift in the form of contact from my great-aunt Margaret, my grandmother's sister who had sent the supportive note weeks earlier. She called to ask if she could visit before the wedding, because she had something she wanted to give me in person. We met at a cafe near her home, and she arrived carrying a small wooden box that showed signs of age and careful preservation. She explained that the box had belonged to my grandmother's mother, my great-grandmother Elizabeth, and that it contained letters and documents that told a story Margaret believed I needed to hear. Inside the box were letters dating back more than 60 years, Correspondence between Elizabeth and her own mother during a period when Elizabeth had defied her family's expectations by marrying someone they deemed unsuitable. The parallels to my own situation were striking and clearly intentional in Margaret's choice to share this history. Elizabeth had fallen in love with a man who worked as a teacher, someone her wealthy family considered beneath their social standing and unworthy of their daughter. When Elizabeth insisted on marrying him anyway, her parents had attempted various forms of interference remarkably similar to what my father had deployed. They had threatened to disinherit her, had contacted her employer to raise questions about her judgment, and had pressured other family members to convince her she was making a terrible mistake. The letters revealed that Elizabeth had proceeded with the marriage despite intense family opposition. Several relatives had refused to attend the wedding. Her parents had maintained distance for years, only gradually reconciling after grandchildren were born, and they recognized their isolation was costing them relationship with their daughter and her family. The correspondence included reflections Elizabeth had written later in life about that period, where she acknowledged the pain of family estrangement, but expressed no regret about her choice. She had built a happy marriage and a meaningful life with the man she loved, and she had eventually achieved reconciliation with family members who learned to respect her autonomy, even if they never fully understood her choices. Margaret explained that she had watched history repeat itself as my father attempted to control my decisions the same way his grandmother's parents had attempted to control hers. She said that my grandmother, who I had hoped would support me, was probably unable to see the parallel because acknowledging it would require recognizing uncomfortable truths about patterns that had persisted through generations. Margaret had maintained independence from these family dynamics through decades of observation, and she wanted me to know that I was not the first woman in our family to choose authenticity over approval, and that the women who had made similar choices had not ultimately regretted their decisions even when those choices carried significant costs. The letters and Margaret's storytelling provided historical context that reframed my experience. I had felt isolated in my conflict with my father, as though I was uniquely unable to maintain family relationships while establishing appropriate boundaries. Learning that similar dynamics had played out generations earlier, that other women in my family line had faced comparable opposition when they insisted on making their own choices, connected my individual struggle to larger patterns about family systems, gender expectations, and control. The knowledge did not eliminate the pain of my current situation, but it provided perspective that reduced the shame and self-doubt that had accompanied my decision to proceed with the wedding despite family opposition. Thursday and Friday were devoted to final preparations that required attention, but did not carry the emotional weight of earlier tasks. I had appointments for hair and makeup trials, final fitting for my dress to ensure alterations were perfect, and coordination with the photographer Amanda about specific shots we wanted to capture. These activities represented the more conventional aspects of wedding preparation, the logistics that any bride would manage regardless of family circumstances. The normalcy of these tasks provided welcome respite from the intensity of the preceding weeks, and created space to focus on the celebration itself, rather than on the conflicts surrounding it. Friday evening, the night before the wedding, I spent quiet time alone reviewing vows I had written and preparing mentally and emotionally for the day ahead. The vows had gone through multiple drafts as I worked to capture what I wanted to promise Daniel, and what I wanted our marriage to represent. The final version spoke to partnership built on mutual respect, to commitment that honored both individuals rather than requiring either person to diminish themselves, and to shared purpose of building life guided by compassion and integrity. The vows acknowledged that we would face challenges and that external validation would not always be available, but they committed us to facing those challenges together and finding strength in our connection rather than seeking approval from sources that could not or would not offer it. As I prepared for sleep Friday night, I felt a combination of anticipation and calm that reflected the journey I had traveled to reach this point. The wedding would formalize commitment Daniel and I had already been demonstrating through our navigation of opposition and interference. The ceremony would be beautiful because of the intentionality we had brought to every choice, the authenticity that had guided our planning, and the support of people who had chosen to celebrate with us despite complexity surrounding the event. The absence of my parents would be sad, but it would not diminish the meaning of the day. I was choosing to marry someone who saw and valued who I actually was rather than who I could perform being. That choice represented the most significant act of self-respect I had ever undertaken, and it was worth celebrating regardless of who chose not to attend. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather, clear skies and moderate temperatures that would make the outdoor ceremony comfortable for guests. I woke feeling surprisingly rested despite the significance of the day ahead. Jessica arrived early with coffee and pastries, beginning her day of coordination role by ensuring I ate breakfast and stayed on schedule for hair and makeup appointments. Her steady presence provided grounding as the morning unfolded, and the reality of the day settled over me. The morning hours passed in focused activity that prevented anxiety from building. Hair and makeup artists arrived at the hotel where several of us were preparing for the ceremony, transforming the suite into temporary salon. Sophia and Elena joined us for the preparation time, creating an atmosphere of supportive femininity that made the experience feel communal rather than isolated. We talked and laughed while professionals worked on our appearances, sharing stories and creating memories that had nothing to do with the conflict that had overshadowed the preceding weeks. When I finally put on my wedding dress, the moment carried weight that transcended the garment itself. The dress was elegant and simple, fitted through the bodice and flowing from the waist in clean lines that felt both timeless and personal. It was the dress I had chosen for myself, reflecting my own aesthetic rather than anyone else's expectations. Looking at my reflection in the mirror, I saw not just a bride preparing for her wedding but a woman who had fought to reach this moment, who had established boundaries necessary to protect her autonomy, and who was about to formalize partnership built on genuine equality and mutual respect. The woman in the mirror looked strong and certain, and that certainty felt like victory regardless of what the day would bring. The final moments before departure for the venue brought brief emotional intensity, as Jessica helped me with final details, and offered words of encouragement that acknowledged everything we had navigated together. She reminded me that I had already demonstrated the courage and commitment that would sustain my marriage, that I had already proven I could make difficult choices in service of my own well-being and happiness. She said the ceremony would be beautiful and meaningful, but that the real work had been done in the weeks of preparation, in the boundaries I had established and maintained, in the choice to proceed with celebration despite opposition. Her words helped me recognize that the wedding day itself was culmination rather than test, celebration of decisions already made rather than moment when courage would be required for the first time. As we prepared to leave for the venue, I took a final moment alone to center myself before the public ceremony. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this threshold, about the patterns I had recognized and the control I had escaped, about the support I had discovered and the family I was choosing. I thought about Daniel and the life we would build together, grounded in values we shared and protected by boundaries we would maintain. I thought about the women in my family who had made similar choices before me, who had prioritized their own happiness despite opposition, and who had ultimately built meaningful lives that reflected their authentic selves. I felt connected to that lineage and grateful for the courage they had modeled, even when they could not have known how their choices would echo forward through generations. The drive to the Riverside estate felt like traveling toward a future I had chosen rather than a future that had been prescribed for me. The gardens awaited, the guests were gathering, and the ceremony that would mark the beginning of my marriage and the full realization of my independence was about to begin. Whatever challenges would follow, I was ready to face them as a married woman who had already demonstrated the capacity to choose authenticity over approval, partnership over compliance, and joy over fear. The moment I stepped out of the car at the Riverside estate, the reality of what was about to unfold settled over me with a clarity that felt almost surreal. The gardens stretched before me in their full spring glory, transformed by weeks of careful preparation into a setting that exceeded even the vision Daniel and I had held when we first selected this venue. The climbing roses cascaded over the pergola in shades of cream and blush, their fragrance mixing with the scent of fresh-cut grass, and the subtle perfume of lavender planted along the pathways. The string lights that would illuminate the evening reception hung in elegant swags between the old oak trees, and the chairs arranged in neat rows on the lawn awaited guests who were beginning to arrive with expressions that communicated joy rather than obligation. Melissa met me at the side entrance reserved for the wedding party, her professional composure evident but her eyes conveying genuine warmth and what I interpreted as respect for what this day represented. She had witnessed my father's attempt to destroy this celebration weeks earlier, had observed my determination to proceed despite interference, and had supported the planning process with a level of personal investment that extended beyond her contractual obligations. She informed me that guests were arriving steadily, that the string quartet had begun playing the selections we had chosen, and that Daniel was already present with his groomsmen in the preparation area on the opposite side of the garden. Everything was proceeding according to plan, and the security measures she had implemented meant that any uninvited arrival would be managed discreetly without disrupting the ceremony. I waited in the small room designated for final preparations, accompanied by Jessica and Elena, who served as my bridesmaids and whose presence provided both practical assistance and emotional support. The room overlooked a section of garden separate from where guests were gathering, offering privacy while still allowing me to observe the setting where the ceremony would take place. Through the window, I could see guests arriving and greeting one another, their animated conversations and laughter creating an atmosphere of genuine celebration. I recognized friends from various periods of my life, colleagues from work who had become trusted confidants, and members of Daniel's extended family who had welcomed me with unconditional acceptance. The absence of my parents and brother was noticeable, but it did not dominate the scene. The people who were present had chosen to be there, and their choice carried profound meaning. Jessica stood beside me at the window, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder in a gesture of solidarity that required no words. She had been present for so many significant moments of my life, had witnessed my struggles and growth, and had maintained unwavering friendship through circumstances that tested the depth of our connection. Her presence today represented continuity between the person I had been and the person I was becoming, between the choices I had made under pressure to conform and the choice I was making now to live authentically. When she spoke, her voice carried certainty that addressed doubts I had not articulated, but that she recognized from years of knowing me intimately. She reminded me that the ceremony about to begin was not simply a wedding, but a declaration of values and priorities that I had fought to establish. She observed that most people plan weddings without having to defend their right to celebrate their partnerships, without having to establish boundaries against interference, and without having to choose between family approval and personal happiness. The fact that I had navigated those challenges and arrived at this moment without compromising my autonomy or my relationship meant that the marriage I was beginning was already built on a foundation stronger than many unions that proceeded with universal approval and conventional ease. Her perspective helped me recognize that the difficulty of the journey to this point was evidence of strength rather than indication of problems with my choice. Elena checked the time and announced that we had 15 minutes before the ceremony would begin, initiating final preparations that transformed waiting into purposeful activity. She adjusted my veil with careful attention to detail, ensured that the flowers in my bouquet were perfectly arranged, and confirmed that the small personal items I was carrying were secure. The bouquet itself was a masterpiece created by George, the florist who had expressed such strong support when I warned him about potential interference. He had designed an arrangement that balanced elegance with natural beauty, incorporating flowers that held personal significance alongside traditional wedding blooms. Hidden within the arrangement was a small locket containing a photograph of my grandmother from her own wedding day, a tangible connection to family history that acknowledged the generations of women who had navigated similar choices about autonomy and approval. As the moment approached, Melissa returned to inform me that all guests had arrived and were seated, that the officiant and groom were in position, and that the ceremony could begin whenever I was ready. The question about readiness was not merely logistical but offered me final opportunity to pause and reflect before taking the step that would formalize everything I had been working toward. I looked at Jessica and Elena, at their expressions of confidence and affection, and I felt the certainty that had been building throughout the morning crystallize into absolute conviction. I was ready not just to marry Daniel but to fully claim the life I had been building against considerable opposition. The ceremony would mark a threshold between accommodation and authenticity, between living for others and living for myself. The processional music began, the familiar opening measures of a piece we had selected for its emotional resonance rather than its conventional wedding associations. Jessica and Elena walked down the aisle first, their presence signaling the beginning of the ceremony and drawing the attention of assembled guests toward the moment of my arrival. When my turn came to step into view of the gathering, walking alone down the aisle in a choice that reflected my independence rather than following the traditional script of being given away by a father, I felt the weight of every eye upon me and simultaneously felt completely centered in my own purpose. The walk down the aisle became a meditation on presence and intention, Each step carried me past friends and loved ones whose faces reflected genuine happiness for what Daniel and I were creating together. I saw Rachel, my colleague who had provided such crucial support during the most difficult weeks of preparation, her expression communicating pride and validation. I saw Dr. Miyamoto, the therapist who had helped me develop frameworks for maintaining boundaries, whose presence demonstrated her investment in my well-being that extended beyond professional obligation. I saw Sophia, Daniel's mother, whose acceptance had shown me what unconditional family support could look like. I saw my great-aunt Margaret, whose gift of family history had contextualized my struggle within larger patterns and had reminded me that choosing authenticity over approval was not unprecedented in my family lineage. Most powerfully, I saw Daniel waiting for me at the end of the aisle, his expression conveying emotion that transcended the formality of the moment. His eyes communicated recognition of everything we had navigated to reach this threshold, acknowledgement of the courage required to proceed despite opposition, and certainty about the partnership we were formalizing. When I reached him and took his hands, the connection between us felt like completion of a circuit that had been building charge throughout months of planning and weeks of crisis. The difficulties we had faced had not weakened our relationship but had revealed its actual nature, had tested whether our commitment could withstand pressure designed specifically to break it, and had proven that we could function as team even when facing coordinated opposition. The officiant, Daniel's friend Marcus, who had known him since college, and who had witnessed the development of our relationship from its earliest days, began the ceremony with words that acknowledged the unconventional path that had brought us to this moment. He spoke about the courage required to build partnerships based on authentic connection rather than external approval, about the strength demonstrated when people choose joy despite resistance, and about the foundation created when couples navigate adversity together before formalizing their commitment. His opening remarks validated the journey while focusing attention on the promises we were about to make rather than on the conflicts we had overcome. The ceremony structure we had designed emphasized reciprocity and equality, rather than traditional hierarchies or gendered assumptions about marriage. We had written vows that spoke to partnership built on mutual respect, to commitment that honored individual growth alongside shared purpose, and to values that would guide our decisions as we built life together. When the moment came for me to speak my vows, I looked directly at Daniel and delivered the promises I had crafted through multiple drafts and careful consideration of what I wanted our marriage to represent. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.